Welcome to Theory Underground. What you're about to hear is a lecture that we're making freely available thanks to the folks over at Patreon who fund the free content here at Theory Underground. This was recorded as a part of Intro to Theory, an ongoing course throughout the year here at Theory Underground. If you want to get involved, become a subscriber at theoryunderground.com/subscribe. But before we get started, I want to tell you about something exciting. I made a game. It's called Canon TCG, which stands for trading card games. So it's the Canon, the liberal arts trading card game. First of its kind, collectible, playable, lots of fun. But as Matthew Stanley says here, it's not just a game. It is a technology for social engagement and a whole new way of learning. If that's interesting to you, you might want to be there for Canon Fest at the end of August. That'll be your opportunity to get your hands on the first edition cards in this game, play with a bunch of people who are into philosophy, theory, literature, science, math, and alternative approaches to education. And it will be happening simultaneous to TUCon 2026, the Theory Underground Conference. If you want to be there for that, it's a family-friendly event. Get involved now. Apply today. The form is in the description of this video as well as in the pinned comment. Hope to see you there. All right, so before we get to it, just remember, the game that I made is called Canon TCG. It's gonna be awesome. You can support it, you can get involved now. Canon Fest is at the end of August. You're probably gonna wanna be there. All right, now let's get to it. All right, everybody, welcome to Intro to Theory, specifically Intro to Friedrich Nietzsche. Before we started this recording, there was a bit of a conversation with folks in the actual class at the time of this recording about the various things that they've heard, or when they think of Nietzsche, the things that stick around. And I've put a few of those here on the board because I think they're a great jumping off point. And I want to first address a cluster of ideas or feelings, adjectives, or, words that are supposed to point at something and characterize the vibe of Nietzsche. Because I think at the end of the day, the vibe of Nietzsche is a pretty big deal because it's so off-putting for so many people. And a lot of the time, it's most off-putting for people who've never actually heard his voice, never spent any serious time reading him. But if they did try to read him, the chances are they were so wildly out of his context that it just doesn't really hit right. Not the way that it hits for people who have spent some serious time reading the modern philosophers who precede his thinking. This context is one of social upheaval that theorists like Descartes through Kant are trying to theorize. And then the king of them all, the sort of peak philosopher theorist kind of before the rise of this new kind of theory would be Hegel. And what is similar between Descartes, Kant, and Hegel is that they are incredibly difficult to read unless you love to read philosophy. And not only are they difficult to read, but they built systems. They're system builders. For both Descartes and to some extent Kant, they're foundationalist thinkers, meaning that they really set up their theory on a secure foundation. For Descartes, it's the I think, therefore I am. And for Hegel, it's going to be sort of a groundless ground system building, but it's still got its sort of essential set of mechanisms that he then teases out and unravels throughout the entirety of his life's work, but especially if you think about his phenomenology of spirit. These are tome thinkers, system builders who write giant tomes that are incredibly dense and complicated and in a sort of sense feel sterile. They've been cut off from what feels like life, and they have this sort of otherworldly feel to them. Nietzsche does not like that. Nietzsche is deeply educated in these predecessors. Now, to what extent did he actually read Kant's Critique of Reason from cover to cover? Who knows? But what I can say is that he spent some serious time reading the history of philosophy, the philosophy of history, the sciences, the maths. He spoke multiple languages, and he was incredibly advanced for his age. People commonly think, oh, he was 23 years old and holding the chair of some university where he was the youngest person who had ever held that position, and all of this, because he was so prolific and such a breakout success with his first book, The Birth of Tragedy. That's often how we think about it, but what we're missing when we think about that is the fact that prior to him being so young in the university, he was 10 years old, sent off to the most elite boarding school of the time, where he then was doing PhD work by the time he was 12 through 14. I mean, this little guy never really got to be a kid, in a sort of sense. Like John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Nietzsche was put through the ringer. Both of them were doing PhD level work by the time that they were 12 through 14. Both of them were writing in other languages and doing original translations and had elite tutors. And they really got to go deep in a way that no working class kid ever got the chance, right? So he was deep in the canon. He was deep in literature, philosophy, history. And having those roots so deep in all of that from such a young age, I think has a little something to do with why he wanted to break out the way that he did. This is the context for why I will lead off by saying that Friedrich Nietzsche is the first fresh breath of air to come rushing into the spirit of modern Western philosophy. And that in that sense, he is the thinker of the outside. He is the thinker of exit. He is the thinker that we could even say blaze some new path into what we now find ourselves in, which is a sort of philosophy underground that is not within the walls of academia. Friedrich Nietzsche exited academia and went for the mountains. He exited academia and he went on long hikes. And to paint a quick picture of what that was like, first requires this important note, which was that he was at the level of his embodiment daily suffering from severe illness. There's a common rumor that it was syphilis, though we have no proof that he ever was touched by a woman. We have no proof that he was ever actually coming into intimate contact, whether it was commercialized, paid for contact or not. We have no proof. And so in that sense, it is a somewhat vicious rumor. He might be the first philosopher who ever mentions masturbation, which he does. He says that sometimes that's good, actually, right? And this is interesting because before Nietzsche, philosophers did not talk about bodies very much. In Nietzsche, though, not only is he going to talk about bodies, he's also going to say that everything that can be considered a bad prejudice comes from poor digestion. Now, of course, he is a hyperbolic thinker. He likes to drop hot takes. He likes to push statements to their limits. He likes to go for the reaction. He likes to drop bombs all over the place. And it's kind of like he was the first guy who was firing off tweets because he was out there hiking around in the mountaintops. And he was so in so much pain that he could not sit down and write something proper. Very rarely could he actually sit down and write something from cover to cover. Most of the time, the most he could do was just keep his body moving and try to stay out ahead of himself. But there would be these thoughts that struck him like lightning. and then he would write them down, and they were called aphorisms. And so if you have something like this wonderful book right here, The Basic Writings of Nietzsche, a sizable chunk of it is actually aphorisms. But then the same thing could be also said of his posthumously published work, which was supposed to be his magnum opus, but he never truly got to finish it, The Will to Power. The Will to Power is also chock full of aphorisms. I'll just read one off the top of my head. This is from November 1887 through March 88. This is aphorism number 542 from The Will to Power. If the character of existence should be false, which would be possible? What would truth, all our truth, be then? An unconscionable falsification of the false? The false raised to a higher power? If the character of existence should be false, what then? That's just a single aphorism, but it's so rich, you could probably write a dissertation about it. And it's so rich because the soil that he was planted in was deep. And that's to say, the Western canon. He had this training in it, from the age of 10 through, I don't know what his training was like before the age of 10, but we know that by the time he gets into this elite boarding school, he is further advanced than most people alive today will ever get a chance to be, even if you have a super high IQ, or you're just really good at taking tests, or let's just say that you're a speed reader and you're really good at math. It's not going to be the same as doing some kind of thought that is in constant engagement with the entire history of philosophy as well as of history itself. And so this is the context as well, this embodiment, this illness. And at the level of a philosophy of life, or reclaiming philosophy of life, philosophy as a way of life, where the unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates says. We have someone who is taking philosophy back from the ivory tower and saying, no, it speaks to my daily life. It's actually a way that I get through what would otherwise be miserable. It's a way that I actually stay optimistic. It's a way that I actually overcome my illness. His philosophy is a philosophy of breath, of fresh air breathed into the spirit of the history of modern philosophy. It's also a philosophy of radical self-overcoming. And to say self-actualization is to say self-overcoming. For we are all weak animals. This is the nature of the human, is to be a weak animal. The question is, can you become a stronger animal with what's been thrown your way? How are you going to play the cards that you've been dealt? And so in this sense, Nietzsche is saying, no, philosophy is about life. Life, not just abstractions. So in that sense, then, I think it's worth also talking a little bit about the form of life that he was living, because people typically think of philosophers as shut away in a sort of dusty old room in a university, or they are in a cabin somewhere like Rene Descartes. Well, Nietzsche lived very cheap. He rented some humble little space. He would wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning. He would eat a giant bowl of fruit, and then he would leave his house for the next 8 hours, and he would hike all day, and then he'd come back down, and then he'd have a proper meal, and then he would dance. And he was not a drunk. He did not like drinking. He was anti-ascetic, so he wasn't for, telling people, oh, you shouldn't do that. He wasn't for swearing off, things that he found pleasure in, but he was a sober guy who liked to dance. How many sober guys do you know of who like to dance? How many sober guys do you know? Kier said me, but only me. Yeah. How many sober guys do you know who like to dance who are also chronically ill, right? Also maybe you as well. But I'm talking, at the you probably can relate in that sense, but also the chronic headaches, right? It's interesting to me that instead of living like Pascal, who laid in bed and sort of wrote this sort of morose philosophy, or living like Schopenhauer, who was also so influential on Nietzsche, shut away in a second level apartment, writing about how angry he was at the noise of traffic down on the street. Nietzsche said, no, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try to live outside of myself. This living outside of yourself is what we call ecstasy, not the drug that is a lot of times just methamphetamines mixed with some MDMA or whatever. No, ecstasy in its proper sense means outside of oneself, ahead of oneself. Later on, Heidegger will become the philosopher of ecstasy. But he gets that from Nietzsche. So the context that Nietzsche is coming from is of being a child genius who rose into the ranks of stardom in academia quickly, but then whose chronic illness and, I'm guessing at some level, an impatience with the way that things were happening in academia combined to make it so he simply could not hold such a position. He said, no, I am getting out of here. And so then he lived this humble life of eating fruit, taking hikes, and dancing, and then writing at the interstices of that life, which meant that he would drop aphorisms all day long whenever ideas hit him. And then from time to time, he had the energy and the big idea to write out a book. And then he had this super fertile period of time. I think it was like 10 years long, where he was dropping 1 to 2 books every year. He was just pumping out books. You better bet he did not have a lot of correspondence with an editor. You better bet he did not spend a lot of time rethinking what he had said and then changing it. No, he said what he wanted to say and he shot it off to the publisher. And then if he reconsidered and had a different idea that was contrary to that idea, well, then he would write about that and he would affirm it. He did not spend any time negating himself. His body was already negating him every day. He already had a ton of haters in the popular press. He wasn't going to sit around and put himself down. Instead, he was going to affirm life. He wasn't going to spend all of this time critiquing people or responding to their critiques or critiquing himself. He was instead going to constantly move towards affirmation, which is the way that he is a huge change in tenor from Schopenhauer. Now, we're not going to go too deep into this because it's probably TMI, but it does bear pointing out here. Up in the corner, I'll just say there was a huge tendency in Germany at the time which was, by the way, called Prussia, but we'll just keep going with this. It was called, or it became what was called, German idealism, which is to say there was a really great explosion of thought and the rise of an amazing milieu. Hey, Daisy, go ahead and lay down. Hey, Anne, she's like scratching to get out. I suspect she has to go to the bathroom if you want to take Daisy out. But there was this rise of a new milieu / school of thought. And it gets called German idealism. And it's people who are responding to Immanuel Kant and his project. And the most important thing that you need to know, if I can just put it in one sentence about Immanuel Kant, is that he basically lays out a very convincing case that we can't truly know very much about the ultimate questions. He still thinks that we might be able to know for sure something about the existence of God, something about the existence of the soul, something about free will. But for the most part, there is a problem, and that is that we exist within a body that has a sensory apparatus, and our mind has certain categories. I think he talks about 12 categories of the mind, and these become a filter, or you could almost think of a factory that helps us perceive reality. So there's a filter slash factory between us and the things themselves. That filter slash factory in us, between us and the things themselves, the ultimate reality, is something that we can't get outside of. We're, in a sort of sense, locked up inside of it. And so anything that you can perceive, observe, test, qualify through scientific method, through induction, through even our rational capacities of the mind, all of this is of the mind. This will later become very important for phenomenology. They'll call it intentionality, but it's basically the idea that anything that you say, I say, oh, look at this cup. Well, this cup is something that is of my mind. It's being filtered and produced by the sensorium, the sensory apparatus, but also by these categories of the mind. Nowadays, people can do something similar, though inferior, by talking about neuroscience. Obviously, if you're more nuanced, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can do a little bit of neuroscience along with some basic Kant. But the point is that from the time of Kant onward, we've had very good reasons to believe you can't get outside of yourself and say anything objective, or at least absolute, about objective reality. So I'm going to go ahead and put the negation symbol here on the board, and I'm going to put the negation symbol right before what I have in brackets here, which will be absolute knowledge of the objective state of affairs. Well, the German idealists were like, we can probably know more than Kant thought was possible. And so we're going to do our best to just kind of get after it. And so a sort of speculative metaphysics arose that was not very epistemologically serious by the standards of what became logical positivism and later analytic philosophy. And so there's a split between analytic philosophy and then what the analytic philosophers called continental philosophy. Analytic philosophers called continental any philosophy that did not fit within its tiny little box of what they thought philosophy proper should be, which was a pretty British thing, even though it wasn't entirely bounded to Britain. And of course, the most famous of those kinds of people who don't take Nietzsche very seriously, who don't take Hegel very seriously, who don't take Heidegger very seriously, who say, oh, that's all this continental philosophy stuff, would be Bertrand Russell. And so a lot of people kind of, in their attempt to learn something about philosophy, will pick up Bertrand Russell's book on Western philosophy, and they'll read these sections on guys like Nietzsche, Hegel, and Heidegger, and they'll go, oh, so there's nothing really of value there. And Bertrand Russell is an attractive guy. If you're just looking at pictures of philosophers, he looks like the archetypical philosopher. You know, he's got his pipe and he's an old man, and he could probably be like a wizard who would give you advice on a journey. And so you read him and then you think, oh, nothing of value there. Well, that is analytic philosophy's entire attitude towards German idealism. But Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and then later a lot of the other people considered continental, are often reacting to German idealism in their own ways, while at the same time being indelibly shaped by it. Bringing it back to Nietzsche's context, we're talking about a guy who lives in a Hegelian/Kantian world. And he doesn't really like Plato, Kant, or Hegel for various reasons. He has respect for Plato, but at the same time, he thinks Plato goes astray and that it creates a lot of problems for philosophy and for Western civilization. And it creates problems for Western civilization specifically because Plato, in his celebration of reason and the forms and of order and of dialectics, tends to prioritize the Apollo side of the gods of the arts as opposed to the Dionysian. So Apollo is like the god of like beauty and order, whereas Apollo is more like chaos and partying and excess and having fun. And those two camps in ancient Greek were always competing. And so you could be a youth in Athens who is involved in festivals of both light, order, and the attempt to understand objective truth and beauty in this sort of way. And then also go to festivals that celebrated the god of drink, Dionysus. But thanks to Plato's influence, Nietzsche thinks that the Dionysian side of the human got repressed. And eventually, thanks to both Judaism and its influence on Christianity, and then Christianity's rise to prominence, all of those things that were Dionysian were turned into evil. And you can think of nobody who does this better than Saint Augustine or Augustine. Augustine of Hippo, writes the Confessions. And he's basically just going super duper into depth about how guilty he is, right? It's this very like Catholic guilt kind of thing. It's beautiful also, by the way, but it's also just like, it is the book of a guilty conscience that is really embellishing that guilt and trying to turn it over as some kind of a lesson about how beautiful God's grace is, okay? But what's important about Augustine as a bridge between ancient Athens and Christendom is that it is Augustine who brings Plato into the church. So Catholicism was already very repressive towards the Dionysian, but then through Augustine, it becomes even more so. And it was his assessment of this problem that initially got him out there with his The Birth of Tragedy. This is where he talks about these mythic gods and how people used to celebrate both of them, but eventually people kind of shifted to only prioritizing order and light and never indulging the excessive, bestial, more instinctual urges. And then that got turned into something evil and something that you needed to go to confession for, right? Nietzsche doesn't like this. So he takes issue with Plato, but more popular during his time would be Hegel and Kant. And so there's a sort of split between Hegel and Kant, and nobody who he read was as big of a Kantian, really, as Arthur Schopenhauer. And what's interesting about Arthur Schopenhauer is that he is teaching at the same university as Hegel. And he does not like Hegel because Hegel is very famous. And Schopenhauer's like, he shouldn't be so famous. Why do so many people go to his lectures? Schopenhauer resented Hegel so much that he purposefully booked his seminar sessions to be at the exact same time as Hegel's. He wanted to force the students to have to make a decision between him or Hegel. And as a result, nobody attended his lectures. And he's so resentful that he proceeded to lecture anyway to an empty room. Arthur Schopenhauer was a curmudgeon. And if you look up images of him, he looks like it. Not only does he look like a curmudgeon, but he also looks like Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Yeah. So he looks like Scrooge, but he also sits around and writes really resentful stuff about how much he hates living in the city and how much he can't stand the noise down on the street and how people are constantly interrupting him. That's the sort of pessimism at the level of a lived existence that it's kind of all you need to know about him. Because then when you go and you actually read his more intense and serious philosophical work, it's like all of that, but now put to philosophy. And Nietzsche was profoundly impacted by it because it is at the same time, though I've just gone ahead and made it sound terrible, it is also funny and beautiful. Schopenhauer might be one of the greatest writers from the entire history of philosophy. You know, it's incredibly problematic that the most beautiful writers are often the ones who are the greatest cynics, who are very pessimistic. I don't know what to make of that. You know, Kant seems like a well-adjusted, pretty optimistic kind of guy who writes incredibly boring, very dry, giant tomes. And then along comes Schopenhauer, and it's beautiful, it's poetic, it's funny, but it's also seeping with resentment, with envy, with aggression, right? And Nietzsche was profoundly impacted by Schopenhauer. He really liked Schopenhauer as an alternative to Hegel. He really liked Schopenhauer as an alternative to just reading straight up Kant. But he didn't like the nihilism of Arthur Schopenhauer, which brings us to this very important word that I have underlined here on the whiteboard, nihilism. You see, Friedrich Nietzsche, as we went into prior to the beginning of this recording, as Keir said, everybody wants to claim him, whether they're on the right, whether they're on the left, whether they're Christian, whether they're atheist. Seems like everybody wants to claim Nietzsche. Also, everybody has their own Nietzsche. And he's also got a stigma of being somewhat of a cynic, but if not just cynic, straight up nihilism. But it is a mistake to think of him as the founder of nihilism, when in reality, he is a response to nihilism, as Kevin brought up. He is a response to nihilism. And specifically, we could say a response to Schopenhauer's pessimism. Schopenhauer is such a sad boy. And Nietzsche was like, man, why don't you get the hell out of your stuffy little apartment in the middle of the city where you're always angry about all that noise and get up into the hilltops? And this is why he said things like, never trust a thought that comes from stale air. Never trust a thought that comes from stale air. And the worst prejudices of the philosophers come from bad digestion. Why? Because these guys sit around all day. He's the first critic, in a sort of sense, then, of both academia and of the fake email job. Of course, these weren't email jobs. These were, obviously couple hundred years prior to emails. But what did they become? They became like emails, which is to say you just sit around all day and you don't really have any sort of sense for place or for actually getting out there into the world. Now, with all of that said, I would honestly say I've done almost about as much as you have to do in an intro lecture, because I've probably said something that will stick with you, and it will hopefully help you break out of your some preconceptions perhaps of Nietzsche. Who knows? But what I want to do now is talk about what I take to be the most important thing about Nietzsche, which would be his will to power, his idea of the will to power, and how that relates to this thing that, if you read it too quickly, looks like resentment, but in reality is a French word that has not been translated into either German or English, because there really is no substitute. It's a special word that if you say it in the anglicized way would be ressentiment. And if you say it in the slightly more pretentious French way, it would be ressentiment. And I pick my battles when it comes to whether I say something with the accent or not. Like, I don't say Lacan, I say Lacan. Some people say Lacan, and, fair enough. Some people make fun of people who say Deleuze, and they say Deleuze. Okay, I don't make fun of people who say Nietzsche or Nietzsche. Nietzsche is how Germans say it for the most part, and Nietzsche is how a lot of Americans say it. And if you pay attention, every once in a while an American says Nietzsche, and they just say Nietzsche. And I draw a line between Nietzsche, and Nietzsche. I don't know why people started saying Nietzsche. I think that's kind of crazy. It's Nietzsche or Nietzsche. You can say resentiment or ressentiment. I don't care. I say ressentiment just so that people know I'm not saying resentment. Because if I say resentment, they'll think I'm just misspeaking. And so I say ressentiment, so they go, okay, we're dealing with some word. What's going on here? And then I have to explain it, which is what I'm excited to do for you all here. But you cannot explain ressentiment without first getting to the will to power. Quick little commercial break to let you know about some news from Theory Underground Publishing. My first book, Waypoint, is officially re-released as a second edition. It has a new foreword to it. It's going to be really useful for anybody who's wanting to think deeper about time energy theory, or the rest of that book is going to be really important for anybody wanting to see where time energy theory really comes from in the first place, because that Waypoint is a collection of my essays leading up to a time when I quit from activism, influencer work, and academia, and then took some time out to really think about what I was doing before I finally launched Theory Underground and wrote Time Energy. And so if you're interested in the origins, so to speak, then you might want to pick up a copy of Waypoint or listen to it on Audible. That's right, it's a narrated audiobook thanks to Cy Ewald. So check that out, and yeah. And I've already said a little bit about Schopenhauer. All you really need to know is that he believes that will is this thing that is animating the cosmos. What makes the atoms move in the void? What makes the plants grow? Oh, the sunlight, the oxygen. Okay, sure. But also, do they not reach for the sun? There is a will, a sort of cosmic will, an animating force inherent in all creatures that pushes them. And it's not just creatures, it's matter itself. Everything that is on the move under a microscope is being animated by this thing called will. And that's for Arthur Schopenhauer the case. Nietzsche takes that idea and he goes a little further with it. He takes it past the finishing line with this concept of will to power. where the three words are hyphenated to make sure that you really know we're talking about a unified thing. And as Heidegger says in volumes 1 and 2, this is definitely in volume 1, around page 38 of his lectures on Nietzsche, will to power is also kind of like saying will to will. It's kind of circular unless you develop it and go deeper. Because for Nietzsche, we're really just emphasizing that will is not like, you can't just relate it to like the faculty of will that a psyche possesses. Now, for philosophers, like the faculty of will is something that's like the faculty of reason. It's this department inside of you as an institution, you could almost think as a metaphor. You have the reason department, you have the will department, and when you get them in harmony, you're able to reason, I should do this, and then your will is able to get you to act on that decision. Well, that is not what we're talking about when we talk about will as a sort of cosmic force. And it's not what we're talking about when we talk about will to power. Nietzsche does talk about the will to power as though it's a psyche kind of thing, as it's a faculty of the mind kind of a thing. He does talk about it that way because it is also that. But it is also the thing that animates plants and animals. So it is not something limited to the human psyche or one of its faculties of the mind. The will to power is what precedes our faculty of will. And the point about it being to power is that whether you say, I should make myself some tea, or I should go on a walk, or I should be working out, or I should not be eating an entire pie before bed, whatever it is that your will is going to do, it's not just doing it because of reason. It is always also, first and foremost, doing it because of power. Now, there's a way of taking this that says that that is the will to dominate, and that is not correct. Walter Kaufmann spent his career showing that that is not correct. Now, Nietzsche will defend, to a certain extent, the old aristocracy that used to dominate and conquer and live itself in existence by subjugating others. And his defense is to simply say, look, guys, if you want to know what the definition of good versus bad always was, good meant good for the people who are saying it's good. And so for the old aristocracy, good was whatever helped those who gained power to exercise their will to power, to self-actualize. That was the definition of good. Later comes along priests in Judaism and Christianity and later socialism. And they have a way of redefining the word good so as to make this sort of master idea of goodness the new evil. And in fact, they sort of invent evil itself. Because in the pagan approach, there was good and bad, as in this is good for us or bad for us. But then along comes Judaism and later Christianity, and now we're talking about evil. The things that are good for those in power are often considered evil by the church. Now, I'll get a little bit more into that before we really get into Ressentiment, which is where we can really talk about the rise of this inversion of values. But first, I just kind of want to wrap this disclaimer up by saying, yes, he defends the old aristocracy to a certain extent because, it's important to do so considering the fact that Christians and socialists were going so far out of their way to make them the worst evil. But then he wants to be like, yeah, I'm not saying that we should all be the new aristocracy or master class. I am saying that we, free spirits, need to realize that this is all what we basically nowadays call a social construction. And it's serving a class. The question is it good for you as an individual? Does believing in good versus evil in this Christian or socialist way actually help you live a life where you can live beyond yourself and your misery, where you can conquer your illness and overcome? Or does it mean that you're going to wallow in your misery and make things worse for yourself? For him, the point is to counter nihilism, which is the sort of approach of Schopenhauer. And by the way, Nietzsche basically accepts the diagnosis that we do indeed live in a nihilistic society. The death of God was not something that he was promoting, it's something that he was responding to. The point is, we live in a world where God used to be the center of everything, helped give everybody some kind of a direction. Now we've lost that center. Everybody's kind of just pursuing whatever. Everyone's kind of making things up out of whatever. You have socialist, anarchist, liberal uprisings, burning down museums and killing priests. And so there's this sort of anti-intellectual, anti-artistic, anti-people getting to have nice things spirit in the air that he was born into. And he finds it's completely stultifying, and he's very claustrophobic around that kind of energy because it's very nihilistic, and what he wants is something beautiful, and he wants to be able to overcome his weakness. And so he says the point of his philosophy is to embrace fate and to live a kind of life that if you were cursed to repeat your life over and over and over and over again, what he calls the eternal return, if you were cursed to relive that life over and over and over again, you would be able to say, yes, I get to do it again. Yes. This is not the sad attempt at that by Camus. Camus' Sisyphus pushes the rock up the mountain and then it falls back down and then he has to push it back up. And he says, we must imagine that Sisyphus is smiling. But Camus is such a sad sack. And Nietzsche is clearly having fun and is like, no, but like, it's not that we must imagine that Sisyphus is smiling. Smile! Live your life, man. Get out there. Don't imagine it. Do it. Make it happen. All right. So yeah, he's kind of positive in that sense, and he insists on not being reactionary. He thinks that, Schopenhauer's entire life is sort of this living in the shadow of Schopenhauer, or Schopenhauer's entire life is this living in the shadow of Hegel. And he's like, no, man. You spend all your time reacting against Hegel. Why don't you live and actually have your own positive ideas? Why is everything you're doing actually like this reaction? So actually, Nietzsche is one of these guys who coins the term reactionary in a sort of sense. He calls reactionary those who live their life in reaction against something, right? This is part of why I try and fail, but try to not live in reaction to the left. And I try to, and I think I do succeed to some extent, do stuff that's just different, right? But the point is like, yeah, if you find yourself a part of something and then you want to extricate yourself from that thing, but then you spend the rest of your life critiquing that thing, have you really extricated yourself from that thing? Or are you not like doing a project of sorts of trying to reform it? And Nietzsche's like, I'm not going to try to reform Kant, Plato, or Hegel. I'm going to break out and try to do something different. And instead of saying no to everything, which is how he kind of thinks of Schopenhauer, he's going to say yes to things. And I think it's important here to remember that he was suffering daily. And I think it's important to remember, and this might be something that a lot of people don't understand. The most optimistic people can be the most depressed people in a sort of sense, right? It's because you know that if you just lean in to that depression, it's going to consume you. And so you say, I refuse to lean into this. I'm going to instead run ahead and be out ahead of myself and change my life. And so that is exactly what he's all about and what he's trying to do. Which is, before we bring it back to will to power and how Ressentiment comes about and how this will help us think about the reevaluation of values and the call for an Übermensch, which is very important for him. And then finally wrapping it all up with Perspectivism and how Perspectivism is sort of his response to this loss of any certainty about absolute knowledge of the objective state of affairs. I first want to point here to this cartoon on the board. Never mind this cartoon. I realize this is kind of just sitting here doing its own thing. You know, Canifest and TUCon, August 27th through 29th. That's what this is saying. The crazy cartoon guy is just a way of kind of highlighting that. But this cartoon is of a camel that becomes a lion, that becomes a child. And because Nietzsche was a boy, I made this child into a boy who's flying a kite and has a little hat and a gun. Just having the best time. And the idea comes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is one of the most important works by Nietzsche. And it's also a big part of his rise to fame. And it's sort of supposed to be read like scripture. You know, as the first positive atheist in a sort of sense, he wanted to write something that really helped people understand the times. And he wrote it in the sort of prophetic voice. And it's a text that a lot of people getting into philosophy will often spend some serious time reading. And it's a text that you might spend the rest of your life going back to, because every time you read it, like any work of scripture, it's going to have so much richness because it has all these parables, right? And so this is just one of the famous parables. It's about how, like, you have to go from being a camel to a lion to a child. This is like the process of self-actualization. It's not wholly chronological because you can be all three at the same time. The point is one of degree. And so, you know, when you are an actual child, you are burdened down with tradition and with rules. And so, of course, if we think about him as a 10-year-old boy going to a boarding school, can you imagine the amount of rules that Nietzsche was living out? Like, this was a disciplined child. Like, no child has ever been this disciplined. So this idea of being a camel that is burdened down under a load, more true for Nietzsche than maybe most children from history, okay? We must go from that to, yes, one day becoming the lion, the courageous one, the one who is ready to fight back, the one who is able to make a name for himself, and maybe to some extent do so in defense of that tradition. But the point is like, yeah, you're a warrior spirit now. But he thinks that the true final form goes beyond this. This lion is kind of like the Homeric, or sort of, we could say, Roman ideal of the warrior. But he's thinking, no, the real final stage is going to be of the free spirit. The free spirit is the person who gets to choose his own values without worshiping at the altar of society, without worshiping at the altar of tradition, without worshiping anyone or anything, right? This is an approach that says, I'm a free spirit. I get to make my own values. And I get to make my own values creatively. And so, of course, we can see then why He's so popular for artists, right? He is a breath of fresh air. He is the philosopher of self-overcoming, but he is also the philosopher of rebelling against tradition, rebelling against the responsibility to be a lion on behalf of society, of making your art to advance some kind of a political or religious cause, of using your art to serve tradition. He's saying, no, go your own way. And so that's why he is also so important for me when I think about the rebellious priest class. If we say that the professional managerial class is a special variant of what every society has, which is a priest class, then it's very interesting that Nietzsche is actually born while Karl Marx is writing the 1844 manuscripts, because Nietzsche is born in 1844. So here Marx is writing and really developing his career, and he spends the next 40 years pushing the limits of his thought, and he eventually writes these 3 great volumes of Das Kapital. And he has this whole theory of capitalism and how capitalism is going to be superseded or sort of evolve thanks to the help of the working class becoming a larger and more disciplined force in the world. It will just become this sort of socialist society that will eventually achieve communism, right? And one of the many things that Marx did not see coming was the way that progressivism at the beginning of the 20th century was going to develop a universal schooling system meant to create a new kind of meritocracy, a new kind of professional managerial class, a new division of labor, and ultimately a version of the priest class that could get out ahead of working class organizing and forever fraction the movement and make it impossible to ever do the things that Marx was imagining. And all of this as a reaction, a literal reaction to working class organizing, to revolutions, to unions, etc. I talk about this in the professional managerial course at Theory Underground, and we don't have to get any more into it than that. The point is that Nietzsche is the poster child of this rebellious priest class, and that when we think about the bohemian, artistic sort of impulse to be a free spirit, while at the same time being a part of the institutional avant-garde, no wonder they want to go to Nietzsche. Nietzsche tells them, you don't have to read Plato, you don't have to read Kant, you don't have to read Hegel, you don't have to know philosophy. You can just run around and say what you think and do whatever is considered edgy by the standards of tradition. And you can renounce your responsibilities as a adult lion and instead just be that free spirit who flies the kite and runs around and shoots toy guns. Okay? Now, I say all of that because that's, I think, genuinely how he gets picked up and the influence that he has. But that is obviously not what Nietzsche had in mind. Nietzsche does not want that at all. In fact, he's not thinking about such things. He's thinking about how he went from being a 10-year-old child who was burdened down by so much knowledge and so many rules to being a sort of courageous lion who was advancing this sort of culture that he then realized, oh, I could just leave. It's like that skit from I Think You Should Leave where the car is high-centered and he's having to argue with the guy who was just road raging at, who's standing by his window, and he's like, he's sitting here and he's acting all apologetic, and then he goes, wait, I could just leave. And then he opens the door and he runs away from his car and leaves it there. And the point is like, yeah, you found yourself in some situation and then you go, wait a minute, I'm like sitting here addressing myself to this other. I could just leave. And he was the one who left. He left the plantation. He left the prison of academia. And so I can't help but think about this metamorphosis from camel through lion to child as anything other than a story of escape from the claustrophobic sort of confines of that extremely traditionalistic and disciplinary world that he had been raised in. And then finally, I bring it down to he was also supposed to become a pastor like his dad. He was also supposed to join that priest class in the most literal sense. Like Martin Heidegger, he said, no, I'm not going to do it. So bringing it back then to his critique of the priest class, of Jews, Christians, socialists, and ultimately women. These seem to be his four big punching bags. And I'll address the last point first, which is just to say, he says a lot of nasty things about women. People like Walter Kaufman will also try to highlight the fact that he says some really nice things about women. They'll try to highlight the fact that he had a couple of good relationships with women. And then I would just say, yeah, but I don't think he ever was truly loved by a woman. And I don't think that, I don't think we can think about him as a person who wasn't, at the end of the day, both childless and untouched. And that he was a hurting person. And maybe he couldn't support a wife, but also maybe he just actually couldn't tell the difference between a genuine loving relationship and the one of obligation, or of, on the other side, prostitution. I think that he never really thought about women very deeply. He just kind of reacted to women. And this is where I say, in a sort of sense, he is, though he is a father to us all in the underground, in a sort of sense, he's also kind of an incel. People might say, no, he's a vol-cel. He's voluntarily celibate. And then some people might say, no, he's not celibate at all. He was going and seeing prostitutes. That's how he got syphilis. We don't know. It's all speculation. But a lot of the things that he says it feels like someone who's just hurting for love. A lot of it reads like a beautiful mind who's incredibly hurt. And I can't imagine that he had much of a relationship with his mom if they sent him to a boarding school at the age of 10, right? So keep that in mind. But also, with all of that said, he has a critique of women, socialists, Christians, and Jews that is something that needs to be taken seriously. And the people who take it the most seriously are usually the best Jews, Christians, socialists, and women. What I mean is that there are almost natural, I don't want to use the word natural, but there seem to be almost like natural tendencies that need to be countered in Judaism, in Christianity, in socialism, and and this would be problematic perhaps to say, but I'll go out on a limb and say it, the inherent nature of females. Okay. What is that? And it is simply to say, with the last point, people say the weaker sex. They used to always say the weaker sex. Nowadays, people don't say that anymore, but people would say the weaker sex. And obviously there's some women who are extremely strong physically, but also women have a different kind of strength. And so it's not fair to say the weaker sex, because most women, even if they might not be physically stronger, have a different kind of strength. And it's the kind of strength that can bring new life into existence, and that can be either a literal mother or a spiritual mother. And either kind, physical or spiritual motherhood, requires a kind of strength that no man can truly know. And insofar as that man really could know, it's going to be hard to say that he's a man, right? Because there's some kind of depth and a different kind of strength that it has been known. It is known. Everyone knows this, right? And it's not something that men seem to have the capacity for. I can think of exceptions. I can think of a couple of guys who are exceptional and probably have a better sense for it. But also, I don't think that those guys consider themselves to be men in some kind of a serious sense. They're much more in touch with their femininity. So might it be possible that there's something when you are, generally speaking, considered the lesser, the other, or the weaker, that happens? And for Nietzsche, yeah, it would be this sort of victim mentality. Right. And then, of course, feminism comes along and says, well, victim mentality for a good reason. Women are the victims of history, and specifically of male abuse. And Nietzsche would say, good, well, okay, yeah, sure, but what's the solution? Is the solution to double down on the victim mentality and to trump up a sort of narrative that makes you embellish that and live in that? And the reason, obviously, that he doesn't think it's good to live in a victim mentality is because he has seen where that will take you. It'll make you into a Blaise Pascal. It'll make you just lay in bed like an invalid and say no to life. No to life. It'll make you into a Schopenhauer. No to life. And he's saying, no, you should be saying yes to life, which means you should be saying no to a victim mentality. Okay, so what I said was that women, I said the best women, the best socialists, the best Christians, the best Jews, in the world of the intellect, at least, are very influenced by Nietzsche. It's not just because they're refusing a victim mentality. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying, and this is purely my prejudice, but my favorite Jewish woman would probably be Hannah Arendt. And then the other one would be Simone Weil. They're probably the two greatest women philosophers of the 20th century. Neither one of them got sucked into second wave feminism, to their credit. And both of them they're affected by Nietzsche in a tremendous way. And in a way that would have been, I mean, they wouldn't have been what they were if it wasn't for the fact that they took Nietzsche as seriously as they did. Hannah Arendt is a political theorist and Simone Weil is a mystic. And both of them are able to achieve new heights that no one else could have ever reached because they didn't get caught up in the kind of ressentiment that Nietzsche is going to warn us against. Okay? Well, the same thing is also true for a whole lot of other Jews and Christians. Okay? And if you want to read a Christian who's going to critique his critiques of Christianity, there might be no better Christian who loves Nietzsche and his concept of ressentiment than Max Scheler, who also happened to be a phenomenologist who was extremely influential on Martin Heidegger. So talking about like your bang for your buck in terms of reading, you get to read somebody who does a lot with Nietzsche, but then also has a big impact on Heidegger. Max Scheler, in his book Ressentiment, expands on the theory, which I'll go ahead and outline in a second here. He expands on the theory of ressentiment, and then he argues why, actually, though it can be the case for Christians sometimes, Nietzsche is really missing this very important thing about Christianity, which is that in a sort of sense, it does something to get us out of the vicious loop that we're about to look at. And then obviously, like, most of the people in the Frankfurt School were Jewish, half the people in the post-structuralist French scene were Jewish, and then they were all huge into Nietzsche. And they just wouldn't have been able to do what they did if it wasn't for the fact that they had to think through his critique of the tendencies that commonly arise within groups that are more empathetic and universalist. Because ultimately, it is the idea from Jesus that the first shall be last that is the sort of heart and soul of ressentiment. And that's not to say it's not true. It's not to say it's not beautiful, but it is to say that can become a savage trap from which thinkers get stuck in for their entire lives. And because they get stuck in that trap, they never become anything else. And so in a sort of sense, some of the greatest Jews, Christians, socialists, and women from the 20th century arguably were so great because they passed through Nietzsche, lived in dialogue with Nietzsche, and then came up with their own critiques of Nietzsche, but ultimately were able to do things for these tendencies that would have otherwise been possible without that influence. And that's because we all benefit from a very deep self-critique. A deep self-critique. And there is no deep self-critique that's going to be more beneficial for you as an intellectual than the critique of Ressentiment. Now, we don't have to understand the theory of will to power and believe that it's true in order to get the most from Ressentiment. It could be the case that will to power does not animate every plant and animal, and that we don't have this inherent will to power, and that Ressentiment still exists. Ressentiment could still be a thing. Quick little commercial break here to share that members at Theory Underground really drive everything. This is ultimately my project for the development of my theory, but it is also something that helps other people in the development of their own theory. And if it wasn't for other people who are finding that useful, well, I don't know that I would be here today. And so I want to say thank you to the membership here at Theory Underground. You guys make all of this possible. If you are interested in becoming a member at Theory Underground, that's how you would access the ongoing and past courses and seminars at TU, as well as office hours, the lecture boot camp, as well as the Reclaim Writing workshop, or the Projectus cohort, which are all things available to people depending on the tier that you become a member at. Okay, and so yeah, it can be a lot of fun, and it's also a great way to take what would otherwise just be a hobby and instead turn it into a serious undertaking. So I'm not saying that everybody who's not involved is not doing something serious, but I am saying one of the best ways to get serious is to become a member. All right, and that's how you're going to meet a lot of cool people, learn a lot of really cool things, and also, this is one thing I really wanted to plug right now. It's also how you would get access to the year-long course being taught by Samuel Lonkar. Dr. Samuel Lonkar is teaching Philosophy of Religion. It's a course that gives you a deep look inside of the heated debate over the nature of religion, philosophy, and science. No one better, perhaps, could be teaching this course than Dr. Samuel Lonkar. We've had a lot of amazing professors join and teach guest lectures and courses at Theory Underground over the years that you can access as a member. But Samuel Lonkar is the guy for this year, and he's killing it. People are loving it, and I am proud and honored to be able to host him. And so if you want to get involved, yeah, you get access to my stuff, you get access to his stuff, you get access to a lot of really cool stuff. So theoryunderground.com/subscribe is the best way to do it. Hope to see you soon. And so there's a cheap way of talking about Ressentiment that I have found, and it's cheap in the sense that it's easy for people to buy. It's not the hard claim. The hard claim of Ressentiment comes with this whole metaphysics and all of these metaphysical assumptions about the way that the world works. The soft claim is just this. When people are always tired, when people are exhausted, we look for cheap ways to feel okay about ourselves, to feel intellectually, morally, and even aesthetically okay. Do you want to feel intellectually, morally, aesthetically okay about yourself? Well then, I've got a consumer demographic to sell you on the internet, because no matter what your thing is, there's going to be someone to come along and tell you you're okay. In fact, you might not just be okay, you might be superior to others. The best way to feel intellectually superior to others might be to be a Democrat who only watches CNN, because it's going to constantly tell you that you're the more intellectual side of the country, and it's the other side that is a bunch of morons ruining everything. And if you want to feel like you're morally superior, guess what? Fox News is here to tell you that the left is evil and is ruining everything. Now, just by sitting on the couch and consuming this media and doing actually nothing, you get to feel like you're a part of something that makes you, if not just intellectually, morally, and aesthetically okay, then in actual fact, superior. This is what I'm calling the weak or cheap case, the cheap version of ressentiment. I ascribe to the weak version of ressentiment. The much harder claim is one that has a whole bunch of metaphysical assumptions behind it about the will to power. And I think that there might be something to it, and I think it's worth taking seriously. But this cheap case is actually totally useful as a underground theorist. You need to always be asking yourself if you're thinking in a way that is fallacious, if you're thinking in a way that is convenient. And there's nothing more convenient than ressentiment, which is to say subscribing to beliefs or values that by doing actually nothing makes you just have like this default sense of intellectual, moral, or aesthetic superiority. Oh, isn't that convenient that you believe the definition of good is the way that you already are? Oh, isn't that convenient to be on the right side of history when in fact you literally do nothing? But the much stronger case is powerful and worth spending some time with. Max Scheler's book on ressentiment goes for the hard case. And he doesn't just say it. He doesn't just say it, man. I would say he says it a little different than Nietzsche, and that he says it in a way. I've gotten feedback from people. They say it this way. Somebody read Waypoint and gave me feedback that said, I disagree with how you talk about ressentiment. You're missing about how ressentiment becomes rage, spite, envy. And it's this constant need for superiority. And I said, no, I'm not missing that. It's just that I downplay that because I think that you can just go with the cheaper version of ressentiment. It's a lot easier to buy. This version, I think, maybe projects a little too much spite, envy, rage, need for superiority onto everybody else. Do you really think that everyone around you is motivated by these things? Or that they exude these things? I mean, obviously some people do, but it's important to point out ressentiment is not limited to, for instance, socialists or Christians or whatever. No, I mean, they have an important role in history in the development of ressentiment. But the point is that we live in a society where everybody is always in a state of ressentiment. This is where you have to bring in Deleuze. Deleuze's Nietzsche, the seminars that he gave on Nietzsche. He's going to say that the truly radical thing that Nietzsche does is show that ressentiment is the fountainhead of consciousness itself. That there can be no talk of a mind, of a psyche, of a will, of an inner life, of thinking outside of this springing into action that Ressentiment gives us when we turn inward. Ressentiment is this turning inward, away from the world, and then creating for ourselves our own little cocoon where we invert the values of our social order that make us appear weak. And by inverting those values, now we appear strong. It's the laying in bed saying, yes, I'm poor, but it's evil to be rich. And so I'm this much closer to righteousness by being poor. And Nietzsche wants to say, well, isn't that convenient? Isn't that convenient? And now you're never going to get out of bed and actually go do anything. Huh, Pascal? Right? Okay. This harder case is going to say that ressentiment results in a spiteful sort of spirit that wants to see those who are successful get brought down a peg. You see this in cancel culture. It's obvious. They don't like that this person has undeserving success, right? A lot of people hate big name people, not just because they're insufferable, but also because they're overhyped. They have way more than they deserve. And maybe they're also selfish. Maybe they're also egotistical, whatever it is, but you want to see them brought down a peg. Yeah, that is a sort of spiteful spirit, and there might be some envy mixed up with it. Totally. But where does it come from? And this is where Nietzsche is at his best. It comes from the fact that we are all animals who, like all other things, have this will to power, but then we are not actually able to release that will to power on the world and act on the world. We're instead told, no, you can't do that. And so he talks about how our cellar or our basement becomes this thing that is teeming with wild dogs. This is a very male thing. Now, not all guys are going to feel it, but most guys are going to feel it. Some women might also find it relatable. This feeling of, I've been doing what I'm told, I'm playing the game the way I'm supposed to be playing it, but there's this part of me that I have had to restrain that just needs off of the leash. I want to open the doors of the prison and just let myself go crazy. The best TV show about this might be Breaking Bad. Walter White is the domesticated man who did everything he was supposed to do. He's a genius. He's been paying it all forward by being a high school teacher, yet he gets no respect from his students, no respect from his wife, no respect from his son, and everybody just treats him like he's just some dorky dad, and he is, by getting diagnosed with cancer, he gets in touch with the fact that he's actually pretty angry about the fact that he's going to die and that this was all he made of his life. And he feels pretty resentful towards society as a result. And he wants to do something. And first he rationalizes making methamphetamine. He rationalizes it as a way of making a lot of money really quick so that he can leave his family with some money. But in reality, Walter White is trying to let off of the chain this wild part of himself that has been subjugated by society that just wanted him to stay in his place. A lot of people find that relatable. I have to say, there was a time when I took it, when I found it very relatable. And there's obviously better and worse ways to let that dog off the leash. You know, drinking alcohol and running around being crazy with your friends is not the worst way of letting that dog off the leash. But there are certain ways of letting that dog off the leash that bring people together and that are arguably better than worse. And of course, for Nietzsche, he's thinking, you know, those Dionysian festivals, that was a great way for people to let that repressed part of their will to power get expressed and get let out, right? And if we want to think with the French theorist Bataille, this is exactly what his accursed share is all about, right? He's talking about the surplus of jouissance, which means extreme kinds of pleasure that are up against some kind of a limit, and how people have this need to burn off that excess, you know. But I really want to drive into this before we close out on the last part of this, which will be perspectivism, by reading a couple of quotes, because you're not really doing Nietzsche any service if you don't read a couple of quotes by him. And so these are from the Genealogy of Morals. I'll read a few parts of chapter 16, or section 16 from chapter 1. He says, at this point, I can no longer avoid giving a first provisional statement of my own hypothesis concerning the origin of the bad conscience. It may sound rather strange and needs to be pondered, lived with, and slept on for a long time. I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness that man was bound to contract under the stress of the most fundamental change he ever experienced. That change which occurred when he found himself finally enclosed within the walls of society and of peace. The situation that faced sea animals when they were compelled to become land animals or perish was the same as that which faced these semi-animals, well adapted to the wilderness, to war, to prowling, to adventure. Suddenly, all their instincts were disvalued and suspended. From now on, they had to walk on their feet and bear themselves, whereas hitherto they had been borne by the water. A dreadful heaviness lay upon them. They felt unable to cope with the simplest undertakings. In this new world, they no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect. These unfortunate creatures, they were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. I believe there has never been such a feeling of misery on earth, such a leaden discomfort, and at the same time the old instincts had not suddenly ceased to make their usual demands, only it was hardly or rarely possible to humor them. As a rule, they had to seek new and, as it were, subterranean gratifications. He's going all evolutionary on us. He's going all the way back to sea animals becoming land animals, and how much easier it was to exert your will to power when you're born by the water, but now you have to carry yourself around. And he thinks that must have been terrible. He says, all instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn inward. This is what I call the internalization of man. Thus it was that man first developed what was later called his soul. This is what Deleuze is talking about. This is why Deleuze highlights this as the most important thing. The most important moment with Nietzsche is this theory of psychology that says the mind and the inner life of the human, and this idea of the soul, it starts with a turning inward because you can't just exert outwardly. The entire inner world, originally as thin as if it were stretched between two membranes, expanded and extended itself, acquired depth, breadth, and height in the same measure as outward discharge was inhibited. So the more that you turn away from the outer world, the bigger your inner life becomes. Those fearful bulwarks with which the political organization protected itself against the old instincts of freedom, punishments belong among them bulwarks, brought about that all those instincts of wild, free, prowling man turned backward against man himself. Hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of bad conscience. And I hope you hear a little bit of his anti-socialism right there. There's a hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting and attacking, he said, in change, in destruction. Something that absolutely devastated Nietzsche was when working class revolutions resulted in the burning of old art. It just floored him. He just couldn't believe it. It just destroyed him. He couldn't believe that people were doing this, taking some of the most beautiful art and just destroying it, saying, oh, we want bread, we want liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he's like, yeah, but you don't have any respect for good art. You guys don't have any respect for the finer things. You guys, you want freedom, but you're going to turn yourselves into slaves because you have no appreciation for the finer things. The change you want is the destruction of everything good about being human. He says, the man who, from lack of external enemies and resistances and forcibly conned to the oppressive narrowness and punctiliousness of custom, impatiently lacerated, persecuted, gnawed at, assaulted, and maltreated himself. This animal that rubbed itself raw against the bars of its cage as one tried to tame it. This deprived creature, racked with homesickness for the wild, who had to turn himself into an adventure, a torture chamber, an uncertain and dangerous wilderness. This fool, this yearning and desperate prisoner, became the inventor of the bad conscience. But thus began the gravest and uncanniest illness from which humanity has not yet recovered. Man's suffering of man, of himself, the result of a forcible sundering from his animal past, as it were a leap and plunge into new surroundings and conditions of existence, a declaration of war against the old instincts upon which his strength, joy, and terribleness had rested hitherto. Skipping ahead, he says, that will to self-tormenting, that repressed cruelty of the animal man, made inward and scared back into himself, the creature imprisoned in the state, so as to be tamed, who invented the bad conscience in order to hurt himself after the more natural event for this desire to hurt had been blocked. He said this vent for the desire to hurt had been blocked. What does that mean? A vent. It means, like, think about, like, where does hot air escape in a system? Through a vent. Pressure is building up. It needs to get out somehow. And guess how we used to do that? You know that person who cuts you off and treats you poorly at work? You know what we used to do? We used to act physically in response to that. And if you didn't act physically in response to that, you were considered slavish. And then you were, by all rights, made into a slave. It's still the rule of the street. If you're in prison or if you're living in the wrong neighborhood, if you don't stand up for yourself, you become the punk bitch. If you get called someone's punk bitch and then you don't stand up for yourself, you will be made into one. So it's still the rule on the street, and it used to be the rule of ancient Hellenistic societies. It used to be the rule of the ancient people who eventually became Germans. The point is if somebody offends you, you punch them in the face. If somebody takes what is yours, you don't report them to the police and spend the next 10 years trying to get justice. You go and you take it back and you probably shoot them and take some of their things. Well, if you got to actually do the things that you felt instead of stuffing them inside of yourself, then you wouldn't turn inward in this way that creates this whole inner world. So I'll reread that part. He says, the bad conscience, in order to hurt himself after the more natural vent for this desire to hurt had been blocked. Not being able to hurt others, you're hurting yourself now. This man of the bad conscience has seized upon the presupposition of religion so as to drive his self-torture to its most gruesome pitch of severity and rigor. Guilt before God. This thought becomes an instrument of torture to him. But it's that image of gnawing at the bars of your cage that I really want to highlight, because for Nietzsche, it really is a biological thing where you are an animal that has been denatured, has been domesticated, and has had all of your primordial drives turn in on themselves. And it's easy to see that there are people who do this more than others. Some people turn everything back on themselves. Other people, they might still put it out onto other people a bit more. So we can think about, there are people who punish themselves. There are people who punish others. There are people who blame themselves. There are people who blame others. But ultimately, everybody in the society gives into this sort of intellectual and moral ressentiment, which is to say, will to power thwarted, turning back on itself, and then by doing so, redefining values where good versus bad for the conquerors becomes evil versus good. If for the rulers of the world, if for the winners of the world, losing is bad, for the Christians and socialists, well, actually losing is good. And what has been traditionally considered winning, which was conquering, it's the worst evil. Just listen to people the way they talk about colonialism. It's the absolute worst evil. It's the worst thing ever. They don't talk about it like it's bad or unfortunate or unwise. No, they talk about it like it is literal evil. They seethe and they think that people who were colonizers must face the children of the children of the children of the people who were colonizing. They must see justice. There must be some kind of big moment where they are made to pay. This seething vengeance for justice, for social justice, is what he has in mind when he talks about ressentiment, resulting in rage, spite, envy, and need for superiority. Now, I'm closing out on the idea of perspectivism here for one reason, and that is that this is my Nietzsche. This lecture is my Nietzsche. The first lecture I ever went to for Nietzsche was with two professors from Gonzaga University, and they both gave lectures at Gonzaga University on Nietzsche as a part of a series. And the opening, they went into basically everybody has their own Nietzsche. Nobody has the same Nietzsche as everybody else, except for maybe people who are completely on the outside, who never actually spend the time reading him. They all come to the same conclusion that he's the guy with the mustache who said that God is dead, we have killed him, and he didn't like women very much. That's pretty much all people know about him. But if you actually spend time reading him, then you'll come to realize he's doing something for you that's different from what he does for everybody else. And everybody has their own Nietzsche. And I say this because if you ever want to give an intro to Nietzsche talk, I would be there for it, because I'd love to see who Nietzsche is to you. And at the end of the day, this approach to texts and to thinkers and to interpretation is the most Nietzschean thing about me and my pedagogy. I don't believe that there is an absolute knowledge of the objective state of affairs in a text. There is no such thing as the absolutely definitive reading of a text. Every text is going to say something different to different people. Different parts will stand out for different reasons. Different people will have different interpretations. And as Derrida said, some interpretations are better than other ones. You know, as Gadamer and Ricoeur would have said, there's an art of interpretation. You can be better at interpretation. Yes, but also, I can't be better at being you than you are obviously going to be capable of being. You are you. I can't be you. And Nietzsche is a process of individuation. He's a process of becoming. And who will you become by even spending an hour reading Nietzsche? I guarantee it'll be someone different than who you would have been if you had not picked up his work. This is a reason some people avoid him. They like who they are and they're afraid of reading him. He's like taking mushrooms. If you take mushrooms or acid, the chances are you're going to experience some kind of a transformation over the next few years, and you won't be who you would have been otherwise, right? Same thing is true with reading Nietzsche. You know, I think he can make you into someone who is better for various reasons that I've already touched on. I think it's important for us to think about ressentiment, if not in the more expensive case, then at least in the cheap sense, which is to say that we desire and are super susceptible to intellectual, moral, and aesthetic kinds of superiority or at least just okayness. And I say just okayness because, yeah, not everybody is looking for some kind of crazy superiority, but a lot of people just want to feel not stupid and, or not evil and not stupid and not ugly, right? That's why we want at least some kind of aesthetic okayness. And so people who resent those who push the bounds of aesthetic beauty, who are constantly saying, oh, the new thing, this is in fashion, this is what's beautiful. People who resent that is because, no, I just want to feel okay, man. Stop changing the rules on me. But of course, the people who push those boundaries are looking for some kind of, yes, aesthetic superiority. Same thing with the intellect. Same thing with morality. A lot of people just want to feel okay. That's my cheap version of ressentiment. It's my version. This is my Nietzsche. This is what I've done with him. I don't expect you all to do the same thing that I've done with him. You might go a completely different direction. And not only do I endorse that, but Nietzsche endorses that. Because if, as he gets through a sort of Schopenhauerized Kant, the idea we don't really have absolute knowledge of the objective state of affairs, well, then what remains? It's this thing called perspectivism, which will later become phenomenology. Phenomenology is just a rigorous approach to perspectivism. But the idea is that there are no facts, only interpretations. This is from the summer of 1886 from Nietzsche's notebooks. There are no facts, only interpretations. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. And the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. So he's endorsing seeing things from multiple perspectives. What you tend to get is people trying to approximate objective knowledge through the sciences in a way that strips everything down to what is absolutely beyond doubt. Nietzsche's going to say, no, we want to bring into the room people who are thinking way, way, way afield of the sciences, who bring entirely different perspectives to bear. And we want to bring them all into conversation within ourselves so that we can better see the situation in the world. He says, it is our needs that interpret the world, our drives and therefore and against. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all other drives to accept as a norm. That's from The Will to Power, aphorism 481. But here we have from On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, Part 1. The insect of the bird perceives an entirely different world from the one that human beings do. And the question as to which one of these perceptions of the world is the more correct is quite meaningless, for this would have to be decided by the standard of correct perception, which means by a standard which is not available. Does this mean relativism? This would be where people think, oh, that's nihilism. This is where evangelicals especially will say, nihilist! You're saying that we don't have any access to the things except for through interpretation, and that everybody has their own interpretation. All interpretations are equal. We can't really get at the truth. Well, no. He just said we can use all of these different perspectives to observe one thing. The more complete we do that, will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. Now, he's putting concept and objectivity in scare quotes, and this is in the Genealogy of Morals, the third essay, section 12. He's putting concept and objectivity in scare quotes because these are words that have become like idols for people. But he's still saying, yes, we can fill out our concept of a thing and therefore have a more objective take on it. Not everything is going to make itself readily available to that kind of process that is traditionally considered empirical or positivistic. Not everything works like rocks. Not everything works like physical objects. There's a lot of things that, in a sort of sense, really do kind of come down to your perspective. However, he's not saying all perspectives are created equal. He's not saying that in order to understand what something really is, we'd have to consult all existing humans on the planet. I mean, obviously, some people are going to be much, much more incisive and have a much higher cultivated ability to perceive. But yeah, you want to have different people with different perspectives that you are in communion with. Your soul, your mind, your heart, it's able to contain multitudes. You're able to carry on a conversation with Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt and Jacques Lacan and Martin Heidegger and Jesus Christ and the Buddha all at the same time. You're able to do that. It's one of the crazy things about us is that we can have all of these different people and we can allow them to argue within ourselves. And then we can be the judge of the ultimate situation. Now, obviously, we're not the ultimate judge, but when it comes to what we think, we are the judge of what we think, obviously. And so, yeah, we can actually pit our favorite thinkers against each other and think through what they're saying. And we can develop our own perspective so that when you say something, other people shouldn't be threatened. It's your perspective. They should try to take in your perspective to try to see things the way that you see things. And then, sure, they can argue against it. But are they actually trying to see things the way that you see things before they argue against it? Or do they think that nothing in the history of the world is ever going to be okay until we can all be on the same page and all agree on everything? This is not relativism versus absolutism. It is a rejection of the dichotomy. If we have a lot of secular relativists and absolutist evangelicals in American society today, that is to say, we have a bunch of idiots who are on two sides of a coin that is downstream from the positivization of the worst aspects of a Cartesian fixation on certainty or a reaction against that just tries to give up all responsibility for what we actually know, which would be this sort of naive relativism. So in a lot of cases, this absolutism is already relativistic. It's why Christians come along and they say, well, you can't really know anything. If the Bible doesn't tell you what's true, then you have no basis on which to say what is true. And you get this with Andrew Wilson a lot. He's a part of the debate sphere. Raise your hands if you actually know who I'm talking about when I say Andrew Wilson. He's adjacent to Nick Fuentes, on the right-hand side of the streamer debate verse, whereas on the left-hand side would obviously be Hassan and Vosh, and in the middle somewhere would be Destiny. You know, that's a typical horseshoe theory approach. They're all somewhat reprehensible, but also charismatic figures who do live streams and a lot of debating. And Andrew Wilson is an Orthodox Christian who is extremely savage. And I'm not exactly sure how Christian he is, because I think he might be a little too savage to really be Christian. Like there's something about his heart that feels mean and always angry. And so I'm not really sure how Christian he is. But he likes to argue in defense of Christianity. And he will do this the way that I grew up hearing, which is to say, oh, well, you think that it's bad to do this thing. Why do you think it's bad? And then he'll get people into a corner where they actually don't really have anything to base what they think is good or bad on. And then he'll say, see, this is why you can't do anything without divine command theory, without having like an absolute basis through the church and through the, scripture. And I've often wondered, how would I do in a debate with him? Because he's really good at tripping people up, cutting people off, pinning them down on, you're not answering my question, you're not answering my question, and doing this kind of thing that I think I would probably have low patience for. And obviously, if you lose your patience in a conversation like that, then you look weak, and then you've already lost. And so I don't really think I'm cut out for the kind of debate that he engages in when he's talking to an enemy. But I've seen him have a conversation with Hawes, and the conversation he had with Hawes, and I've had Hawes on my channel a couple of times, the conversation he had with Hawes was a lot more respectful. And I think it's because at the end of the day, they're both similar and they have a lot of overflow between their two audiences. One might be communist and sort of multipolar, but the other one is, very American and at the same time Orthodox Christian. Yet there's a lot of overflow because I think that they both took the red pill a long time ago. I think that they both are somewhat patriotic in their own ways. They're pro-patriotism. And then they're also both like anti a lot of left stuff. And so Hawes and Andrew Wilson were able to have a really interesting debate that I do think is worth checking out. And it was basically about communism. And it's fascinating. But I tend to think that the people who live in this debate sphere have cultivated a habitus that is reactionary in Nietzsche's sense, not in the political sense. In that sense, I would say Hassan Piker, Vosh, Destiny, Fuentes, Wilson, they're all reactionary in the sense of constantly reacting to what is trending, constantly reacting to what people are saying in their live stream chat that it has thousands of people chatting in it. As Sai said, both angry men, like recognizes this. Yeah, like recognizes like. Like recognizes like. There's a lot to be angry about. And if you spend a lot of time consuming the news, then you're going to be angry. And you'll develop this thing called news brain syndrome. Don't worry, it's coming to the DSM-6, I'm sure. News brain syndrome. They definitely have it. And what is it? It means that they're constantly following Hate Inc. They're constantly forming opinions that are based in reaction to whatever's trending. They don't ever get some distance. They don't ever take a breather. And I don't really think that they ever touch grass in all of the different ways that we should, which is to say, keeping grounded with children and elders and intergenerationality and soil and risk, violence and sports, right? Like all of the different kinds of things that we should be doing on a regular basis just so that we don't become these embittered little cocoons constantly living in reaction to everything. And that's not to say that they bring nothing to the table. I think that there's stuff to be won from actually paying attention to these people who pay attention to things and who respond. I think that, it's not worthless. But I am saying that I want to think through not just any perspectives, but the best perspectives. I left that debate sphere and that streaming sphere. I left that world. I was on the same platform that Destiny and Vosh were using. I had the same programmer that they had. I was talking to these people. I was doing stuff with these people. I was quickly growing on Twitch, but I didn't want it because it is so reactionary. It was turning me into the kind of person I did not want to be. So if you think I'm bad now, just imagine how bad I would have been if I'd stayed in that. Instead, I've done a lot to go way out of my way to change my life so that I can develop my own kind of perspective and spend a lot of time going deeper and deeper and deeper into some of the deepest perspectives that have ever surfaced from the history of philosophy. It's not a privilege that they get to do. They don't have the freed up time energy to be able to do this kind of thing. And they believe that what they're doing, which is obviously just growing their audiences and making money, I feel bad saying this, but they also want political success. At least they seem to want some kind of political success for whatever it is that they believe. What they're not capable of seeing is how within duopoly extremism, every position is an extreme reaction that is not just reacting to the other positions, but is also invested in triggering and creating more of those reactions. And so it's all very reactionary. And the only way I think that we can actually give ourselves the time to think is to do what Nietzsche did. And this is where I'll close. What Nietzsche did is he gave himself time to think by addressing himself to an audience that was not yet. He addressed himself to a future audience, which is why I have at the top of this board, future facing. I put hyperstition there. We don't have to get into it. That has a little bit more to do with how he influences the CCRU and Nick Land later on. All that we need to know is that he spends his life writing to a future audience. And if you want to read about that, probably the best place would be the preface to his Genealogy of Morals. He says, "If this book is incomprehensible to anyone and jars on his ears, the fault, it seems to me, is not necessarily mine. It is clear enough, assuming, as I do assume, that one has first read my earlier writings and has not spared some trouble in doing so, for they are indeed not easy to penetrate. Regarding my Zarathustra, for example, I do not allow that anyone knows that book who has not at some time been profoundly wounded and at some time profoundly delighted by every word in it. For only then may he enjoy the privilege of reverentially sharing in the halcyon element out of which that book was born and in its sunlight, clarity, remoteness, breadth, and certainty. In other cases, people find difficulty with the aphoristic form. This arises from the fact that today this form is not taken seriously enough. An aphorism properly stamped and molded has not been deciphered when it has simply been read. Rather, one has then to begin its exegesis, for which is required an art of exegesis. I have offered in the third essay of the present book an example of what I regard as exegesis in such a case. An aphorism is prefixed to this essay. The essay itself is a commentary on it. To be sure, one thing is necessary above all if one is to practice reading as an art in this way, something that has been unlearned most thoroughly nowadays, and therefore it will be some time before my writings are readable, something for which one has almost to be a cow, and in any case not a modern man: rumination. Rumination is what cows do. It's what goats do. It's what a lot of different kinds of herbivores do. It's where they have multiple stomachs. And so they eat something and they start to digest it, but then it comes back up in their mouth and they work it over again and then they send it back into another stomach. And the reason herbivores do this, they don't eat meat. They're eating grass and leaves, and grass and leaves have to be broken down. And we as human beings don't even have the power, the digestive power to break down most of the things that a cow will eat, obviously. And that's why they have multiple stomachs. It's this whole process. Kevin said the hermeneutic circle, but it is exactly that. Exactly. And in that sense, Heidegger is taking what Nietzsche develops here to another level of sophistication with the hermeneutic circle. But really, we're talking about writing in a way where you do not assume an audience that is going to be able to say anything meaningful until they've read your work multiple times. Now, that's a way of assuming a charitable audience, a sophisticated audience, an audience with the time energy to actually read and reread. So he addresses himself to a future. Who ends up reading him? Everybody. From Trotsky to Hitler. Literally. From Trotsky to Hitler. From Trotsky's Red Army to Hitler's actual Nazis. We're talking, who does he end up influencing in the 20th century? Everybody. But has anybody actually read him the way that he thinks he would have to be read by this future man, this not modern man? I argue no. No one has read him yet. People have attempted to read him, but nobody's really read him. Who would be able to read him? Who would be able to read him or any other philosopher like him? Definitely not a person who sits at a table in stale air. Nietzsche said, don't trust thoughts that come to you in stale air. No, you have to get out there. Go on a long hike and listen to Nietzsche. Go work with your hands and listen to Nietzsche. Multitask listening to Nietzsche, because this is the way that he was living. This is the way that he was thinking. And this is the way that we, workers with earbuds, are pioneering a new mode of life. We're able to chew gum and walk at the same time. Yeah, in the same way, we're able to listen to books while doing things and then go back over it after having plenty of time to sort of digest it. And through doing that, I think we'll be able to develop a new kind of approach, a new kind of perspective, a new kind of mode. It is unlike anything the world has ever seen. Thank you.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment. Theory Underground has been around long enough at this point that we have people joining who say, I was watching Theory Underground for 1.5 to 2, sometimes 3 years before I decided to join. That's really cool. It's amazing that there's a good handful of people out there in the world who get something from this kind of super niche content. It's not easy, doing stuff that is this niche in this part of the internet, because all of the algorithmic incentives would have me just pumping out more and more and more of the same thinkers, the same thinkers, whatever's trendy, whatever has a bunch of people showing up to talk about it at conferences or whatever. But I like to take a much wider and longer view of the situation and think a lot deeper about who's going to help us really think through the moment. And I like to draw on those people that are the best for thinking about the situation, not just the most popular. And so in that vein, though, Intro to Theory, it's a course unlike any other. What you just saw was Intro to Nietzsche. I've already done Intro to Marx, part of which is up on the channel for free subscribers. But if you become a member at Theory Underground, you get access to the full version of that, as well as the upcoming lecture on Heidegger that I'll be giving. There's also going to be an upcoming lecture on Heidegger by Simon Critchley, the absolute legend. We've got a whole bunch of amazing guest lecturers for Intro to Theory throughout the year lined up, and there's going to be a bunch of other thinkers. We're going to be getting into Lacan and Levinas and Bourdieu and Baudrillard, and we've got guest lectures on Burke and McLuhan and all kinds of other thinkers like Luhmann and stuff like that. So I if you're interested in any of this that's been going on at Theory Underground and you want to get more involved, then now is the time. If you've been watching this stuff for a while and you keep thinking, I might do this, well, now's a good time to be doing it, because Intro to Theory is an awesome on-ramp. And it's happening at the exact same time that we're doing Philosophy of Stewardship. Not at the exact same time. Philosophy of Stewardship happens on the first Sunday of every month. And then Intro to Theory usually happens on the third Saturday of every month. But then we have guest lectures. And also for members, there's a monthly office hours where you can ask me anything and kind of talk about your projects. Then there is, for gold members and higher, a special thing called Reclaim Writing Workshop, as well as Lecture Bootcamp Workshop. So if that sounds interesting, if you want to develop yourself as a writer, as a speaker, this is an amazing opportunity to get involved. And finally, if you want to get involved at the platinum level, this is a great way to develop a project, whether that be a book, a blog, or something else. The Projectus Cohort 2026 is ongoing. It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. Get involved now, theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Finally, just your last reminder here, I made a game. Canon TCG, the liberal arts trading card game. And Canon Fest, the official launch of the first edition of this game, is going to be at the end of August at the same time as TUCon 2026. Apply now. Spots are going fast. This thing will fill out. And it has always been an absolute blast to do stuff in person. Everybody has always loved it. We've never had any problems or complaints. And so if you want to be a part of this thing, it's going to be really great. We've been doing it for 3 years. It's just getting better. Let's go. Let's go. Hope to see you there.